Thank you, everyone. Welcome back to the final session of today. We have two more very interesting papers. My name is Fangming Xu. I'm from the University of Bristol. I'm going to help out with the time management and also raising the very colorful time shift as we approach the final 5 minutes. Okay. So we have the first papers. The speaker is Faye from the University of Delaware. So, would you like to?
Do I need to use this?
Yes, for the online. It's for the online.
Okay.
It goes to the people online.
Okay. Oh, actually.
All right. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers, Anne, Scott, and Paulo, for including our paper on this program. This paper is just a few short months old, which is precisely the right stage to present to an audience of experts and artifacts that can help guide us in our immediate revision. And this is a co-author work with Tom Lee and Dragon Tan, both from University of Hong Kong. And the idea is very simple. We want to look at the impact of climate laws and regulations on cross-border acquisitions. And what motivated us to undertake this study is really I think, increasingly hard to refute fact of life in the world that we live in. That is, climate change is happening, and it's one of the most pressing challenges of our time. And I don't think you have to look beyond the increasingly frequent extreme weather-related events happening around the world to see that. And then in response to the climate crisis, governments around the world have been introducing a slew of regulations and laws to combat the crisis. And these policies or regulations are primarily aimed to mitigate and adapt to climate transition. And they also want to protect countries from becoming havens of pollution havens and the likelihood of carbon leakage or regulatory arbitrage. And I think that it's safe to say that more regulations are yet to come, because last year at the COP26 conference, the governments around the world renewed their pledge to do even more to curb global warming and control the temperature rise over the next to 2050. All right? And it's really not a surprise that based on a recent survey of academics and practitioners and the business people, the regulatory risk associated with climate change is considered the top climate-related risk in the next 5 years. So basically, in the near and immediate future that we can look to. And just a quick summary of these climate laws and regulations that we talk about. Obviously, when we look at laws adopted by different governments around the world, they do vary in nature, they do vary in scope. But I think if you take a look at these laws and regulations, I think they primarily set out a list of obligations and requirements that businesses and organizations need to fulfill, including reducing energy demand, lowering industry emissions, and introduce carbon pricing schemes, and also promoting or even requiring climate-related R&D to either develop a green technology or green innovations. And here are just a couple of examples of the climate laws and regulations that we care about and that we study in this paper. So the first example is from South Korea. I think the highlighted part to give you an idea of the responsibilities that businesses need to fulfill, as well as some penalties that company will have to pay if they don't fulfill these requirements. Same thing with the Carbon Pricing Act introduced in Singapore several years ago. And given the increasing prevalence and importance of national level climate law regulations, there has been an emerging literature that look at how firms respond to climate policies introduced by their governments, including the locations of their carbon emissions, including R&D expenditure, as well as capital expenditure adopted by firms and other financial policies. So what we're going to do here is that we're going to contribute to this emerging literature by looking at how climate regulations the reason for us to focus on, among all of the major decisions that companies can undertake, we focus on cross-border acquisitions for at least three reasons. One is that these international corporate control transactions have profound impacts on global financial globalization, as well as international capital and resource reallocation. And second, these international cross-border acquisitions have been shown to have beneficial effects for target as well as non-targeted firms in countries by importing better corporate governance practice and efficient management of assets. And then to tie this more closely to the climate regulation and policy that we're looking at when deciding which country to go to, which target to pursue in making these cross-border acquisitions, acquirers often have to contend with the target country's institutional features. And I listed several papers here that look at how bank regulations and the labor market regulations impact firms' cross-border acquisitions. So that's really make the climate policy and regulations an important element that firms may take into account in making such decisions. And we developed two sets of competing hypotheses regarding the impact of climate laws and regulations on cross-border acquisitions. The first hypothesis is that we conjecture that after a country introduces climate laws or regulations, it's going to make firms in that country to be more difficult to become takeover targets of cross-border acquisitions. Basically, climate law adoptions in the country will reduce what we call inbound cross-border merger acquisitions. And the reason for this, there are at least three channels for this negative effect of climate laws on inbound cross-border acquisitions. But I think the main channel is that by these climate laws or regulations put constraints, introduce friction and costs on what acquirers can do after they take over a target. Either you're talking about expanding capacity or reducing costs or moving assets across the border. The national laws and the regulations related to climate change will put constraints on that, basically making firms in those countries less attractive for cross-border acquirers. All right, and then so that's really what the first bullet point is about. And then if you think about other possibilities through which in which climate law can reduce inbound cost of acquisitions, you can think about domestic firms faced with increasing costs and challenges in operating that country. A lot of inefficient firms may get weeded out of the marketplace, and then the remaining firms will become more efficient. But this process will reduce the number of attractive targets that foreign acquirers may be interested in. So that's going to also lead to the same prediction here. And then some climate law regulations may actually set up or pass through to prevent regulatory arbitrage, basically discourage cross-border acquisition attempts that may want to take advantage of lax climate regulations in the target country. And this is essentially plugging that loophole. But at the same time, there's also reason to expect that climate laws may increase the tendency of inbound cross-border acquisitions. I have several channels here. This is the first one is related to the passage of climate law regulations actually reduce policy uncertainty. And when it comes to making large, irreversible, or very hard to reverse investments like cross-border acquisitions, firms tend to be encouraged to go along when they know what kind of law regulations they have to deal with, instead of grappling with what could happen, what could take place in a particular country. And then from a long-term standpoint, a target country's law regulations may, regarding climate change, may increase the resiliency of firms in that country to a potential future physical climate risk. And that actually will make these targets more attractive, attracting more foreign acquirers. And then lastly, maybe the introduction of climate laws will create opportunities for foreign acquirers with more advanced technology in terms of developing green technology and green innovation to bring their expertise to the target country to generate value. So you can see here there are arguments on both sides regarding how exactly the climate law regulations impact inbound cross-border acquisitions. And regardless of which side you take, I think there are a couple additional analysis, a couple additional propositions that we can develop. One is that, I think certain firms, certain industries, because they're going to be more impacted by these climate law regulations, whatever the impact on cross-border deals is probably going to be more concentrated or more pronounced in those industries. And then the third hypothesis when it comes to is that when it comes to legal enforcement of these laws and regulations, for climate laws to have any effect, they need to be given teeth. They need to be given legal power to do that. So we expect more pronounced effects of climate law and regulations in countries with stronger legal enforcement. So we put these things to tests, and this is a preview of the results that we discovered. So on average, what we find is that firms are less likely to acquire targets from a foreign country that has recently adopted climate laws. And we find significant decrease in the incidence, volume, and likelihood of inbound acquisitions. And we also find a slew of very interesting heterogeneities in the effects of climate laws on cross-border acquisitions. In particular, we find that when targeted firms are in industries that are most exposed to climate regulations, the results are stronger, as well as for targeted countries with stronger legal enforcement, and the period with when the public, when decision makers are more aware of climate issues. And we also find that not all acquirers, not all foreign acquirers react the same way to targeted countries adopting climate laws and regulations. For acquirers that come from countries that have high concern for climate risk, or for acquirers that come from countries that recently experienced climate disasters, they actually don't shy away from going after targets in countries that recently passed the climate laws, because of their recent experience, or because of the social attitude, they consider any regulatory cost or burden associated with climate laws or regulations as necessary evil, so to speak, or necessary expenses for business to incur. And we also find some very interesting evidence that climate regulations actually can be subject to what we call selective enforcement. That is, not all acquirers from all countries will be subject to the same level of enforcement when they take over targets from a certain country. So basically, if acquirers come from countries that are more politically aligned with the target country, they're not going to be as deterred about the introduction of climate law regulations in the target country. And then we also examine several important shareholder value and operating performance impact of climate laws regulations on cross-border acquisitions. What we find is that after the introduction of the climate law regulations, cross-border acquisitions tend to be associated with much smaller merger synergies, lower takeover premium, higher deal withdrawal probability, and less significant improvement in acquired operating performance after the transactions. And with respect to data, our climate law data comes from a collection of sources that are put together by various agencies and research institutes, including the United Nations and the World Bank and some leading research centers in the world. And we focus on national level laws. These national level laws are either passed through a legislative process or are enacted through executive orders. And we focus on the first adopted major laws in the following categories, including greenhouse gas emission regulations, national climate strategy, and a supervisory committee for climate exchange. And then we use the M&A database from 1985 to 2009, and we apply the Euro data filter to construct a very comprehensive set of cross-border acquisitions that involve 103 unique countries. And we also, in our regression analysis, we use a lot of country-specific controls to identify the effect of climate laws and regulations. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip this page because it essentially gives you an idea of the timeline in which countries around the world adopt their first major climate laws and regulations. And after the adoption of the climate law regulation, just to show that these laws are indeed major and they have impact on firms' emission level, we find that immediately following the year when these laws are passed, there's significant drop in the CO2 emission by firms in those countries. And this is really the baseline regression of our paper. What we find is that the target, the dependent variable is the number of cross-border deals between each acquired and target country pair each year. And the key independent variable is the climate law regulation in the target country. What we find is that in target countries that have passed climate law regulations, the cross-border acquisition in terms of numbers are significantly lower. And we also replace this number of cross-border acquisitions with the deal volume in dollars. We find even stronger results. And this is a dynamic treatment of the effects of climate laws on cross-border acquisitions. As you can see here, there's really not much going on before the passage of these laws, and then there's a significant and permanent reduction in cross-border acquisitions after the law. And here we also try to, instead of relying on an indicator variable representing whether a country has passed climate law regulations, we use a continuous variable that can capture in granular detail about the stringency of a country's environmental policy. And again, we find that when the target country has more stringent climate law regulation, the cross-border acquisitions targeting firms in those countries can be significantly lower. And as I mentioned, we go through a lot of robustness check to establish the credibility of our results. Suffice to say that anything that we try, we find the same results. And here, over the next two tables, I'm going to quickly go over the heterogeneity in the results that we talked about. And I think first here is really one of the first two smell tests that you can run. That is, when you talk about impact of climate laws, regulations on firms, well, you would expect stronger effects when firms are in industries that are going to be impacted by these laws more. And that's exactly what we found. And as a matter of fact, when we talk about firms in industries that are not going to be affected by or less impacted by climate law regulations, we don't have much going on. The second small test that we look at is legal enforcement strength in the target country. Again, you can have all the legality in the world, but if you don't have a powerful enforcement of the laws, you shouldn't have any effects. Again, we use three separate measures of legal enforcement in the target country. You'll find that only when the target country has strong legal enforcement, climate laws in those countries have bites in having a negative effect on inbound cross-border acquisitions happening in those countries. And this is the table presenting results on not all acquirers will respond to the targeted climate law regulation the same way. Here, when the acquirer, high concern represents acquirers coming from countries that have high concern for climate regulation. What we find is that acquirers coming from those countries tend to respond less significantly to the target countries' climate law and regulation. Same thing when the acquirer comes from countries that recently experienced climate disasters, their response seems to be more muted. Paper is about the results of the political affinity between the target and acquirer countries. The idea here is that if acquirers come from countries that are more politically aligned with the target country's regulation may not be enforced on these firms as strongly as they would otherwise, and therefore they should they probably wouldn't react as strongly to the climate law regulations in making cross-border acquisitions in those countries, and that's exactly what we find. And as a matter of fact, the significant effect of the takeover of climate laws on cross-border acquisitions is only concentrated when in countries, in acquirer countries that are having a low political affinity with the target. And this table I want to take maybe 20 seconds to explain. This table is based on a very small sample. Well, this small sample is constructed, with explicit purpose. We want to look at deals that were announced before the target country what we find here is that the introduction of climate law in the target country significantly increased the probability of these previously announced deals being cancelled, being withdrawn. So that's again consistent with the additional frictions and costs and constraints that's imposed on the value creation process of the cross-border acquisitions, basically chilling the appetite of the foreign acquirers to complete these deals. And not surprisingly, consistent with the higher withdrawal probability, we find merger synergies to be significantly lower after the passage of climate laws in the target country, and takeover premium, same, and operating performance improvement experienced by the acquirer, very similar results. To just quickly conclude, what we find is that the passage of climate regulations in the country has a significant chilling effect on cross-border acquisition targeting firms in those countries. And the main channel that we document is that these climate laws impose a significant restriction and cost on the value creation process of these deals. And the implication that we want to draw from this is that regulators need to think a little more carefully about the implementation and design of these climate regulation laws, so that they don't have nearly as much negative impact on these valuable cross-border transactions. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much for the presentation. So the discussant is Philip from the King's College.
So thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity to present to this discussion. I enjoyed reading it. I think it's a very nice paper, and I learned a lot from reading. And so let me just recap what the paper discussed. So the motivation is that we have governments that want to curb climate change, so they adopt climate change laws. So these laws may affect corporate behavior, for example, the location of carbon emissions, the innovation, R&D expenditure, and they also study the effect of these climate change laws on cross-border M&A. They used 45,000 deals between 100 countries in the period 1985-2008, and they studied mainly the number of deals, but also the value of deals for each country pair each year, so they have 37,000 observations. So the results are that adopting climate change laws reduces the number of deals involving targets in the country. These are robust to excluding the US, including only OECD or G20 countries, using the deal value or indicators for number of deals being greater than 0, using continuous climate law stringency variable instead of the dummy for the number of the dummy for law adoption. And they see that the decline in M&A activity is more pronounced for industries that are more exposed to climate change laws, if the target country has strong law enforcement, if the target country there has low political affinity, also for deals that involve large targets. And then they also do some tests to see if, if you announce a deal and then there's an introduction of a law, climate change law, if that makes it more likely for the deal to be withdrawn. They look at the market's reactions if the combined abnormal occurs when the climate laws exist. They see that they're lower. And they also look at operating performance for that acquire, and they see that it is lower when they acquire a target in a country where the climate law exists. So I have some suggestions. I'm kind of reluctant to say them because I think the authors have done a very good job and done a lot of things, but still they have the energy to continue working on this. I think these are some things that they could add. So, first, some questions I had as I was reading the paper about the data. It wasn't clear what's the treatment year for each country, if it's the announcement of a law, if it's the effective date. I think either could work. In principle, you would think the announcement should work better, but maybe there's a lag until firms react, so maybe the effective date may be better. Then there are 45,000 deals in total. I just looked at the average number of deals per country per year. It was 0.63, so that means with 37,000 reservations, there's 23,500 deals in the sample, which is different from the 45,000. Probably I didn't read something carefully enough, but if I did, then in any case it's something that I think the authors can easily clarify. Then on table 14, the effect of an acquired ROA has 3,500 observations, which is much less than the 45,000 deals. I'm not sure if it's because those are the operations for which they have the data, the ROA, but yeah, it was quite a big drop, and I was wondering why that was. Now, regarding the placebo test, here the authors do a placebo where they just randomly draw a year of introduction of a law in a country from the distribution, the empirical distribution, and then they do 1,000 regressions and they plot the estimated effects for the coefficient of interest, this dummy on final law adoption. And the red dotted dashed line is the coefficient estimate with the actual data, and this distribution of the values, of the estimated values from placebo. So first, I think it would be better to show the t-statistics rather than the coefficient estimates, because that would make it easier for us to understand if this distribution makes sense. And if this was the t-statistic estimate, or if we assume that the standard errors are the same across all the estimations, then this would be the statistic distribution. That would mean, if I counted right the number of iterations here, the number of iterations here, that we would have about 5%. So actually, something's not showing here. We would have about 5% of placebo estimates that are more negative, and sorry, this has opened in. Let me just see if I can open it in Acrobat. In any case, so one of the things that about 5% of placebo estimates have more negative values than the actual estimate, and about 10% are more extreme, which, given that the estimated t-statistic for the estimate is 2.19 to 2.49, we should in principle expect only 1.25 to up to 2.5 to be to the left of the red dashed line. So this could indicate that maybe the size of the test is not what it's supposed to be. But in any case, certainly if we had the t-statistic distribution, we would know for sure. Then the authors do this kind of, I guess, interpreted as a sanity check for the dates, the years of the law adoptions, and they see if carbon emissions are reduced after the adoption of the law, and they show that they show this graph basically, which they interpret as saying that yes, it looks like quickly after the adoption of the law, the carbon emissions, the CO2 emissions drop. There's two issues with this. These are 90% confidence intervals. If you had a 95% one, they would be wider. They would be, you can see that this is, I would think marginally statistically significant at the 5% level. But another thing is, I noticed that these are clustered just at the country pair level, not at the year level, as is the case for most of their estimations. So I think that should be added here. And the other thing is that this effect of greater than +3, so basically there's no year right after the introduction of the law where there's a negative effect on carbon, on CO2 emissions. There's a cumulative effect on the greater than or equal to +3, which even if the law introduction, the year was entirely wrong, if 10 years later or 50 years later there was a very big drop in CO2 emissions, you would still see that being here, if it was sufficiently strong. So I think that to make this more convincing, what the authors should do is they should continue this annual estimates until they find the first truly significant negative effect, and then the rest they can collect together in the greater than or equal set. Then for the baseline specification, the authors use this, their dependent variable is the log of 1 plus the number of deals, which is very difficult to interpret because you have this 1 plus, and the obvious thing would be maybe to use a Poisson model, and this is particularly problematic in this case because the vast majority of observations have a dependent variable equal to 0, which is being changed to 1. So what is the interpretation of these coefficient estimates? It's not necessarily just that if you see a 2%, that it's 2% increase, because it's not log of the deal, it's log of 1 plus deal. So using Poisson model could resolve that. Another thing that they could do is maybe with a G20 subsample where probably most observations would not be 0. In that case, you wouldn't need to use the 1 plus transformation, and so just using the log of number of deals, hopefully the results are similar, and so the interpretation of the coefficient estimates would be the same. Then the adoption of climate change laws is correlated across some countries. So it could be useful to cluster at the time region level, not the year region level, because that was subsumed by the year clustering that they already do, but maybe a wider time period, for example, the Eurozone, or even maybe you can control for the Eurozone integration, because it's very likely that in the Eurozone many countries adopted this climate change laws around that time. So that should be maybe part of the regression and be some potential homogeneity. The authors simultaneously, the authors have specifications where they include acquired country dummies and target country dummies, and then separately specifications where they have country pair fixed effects. So maybe why not include acquired country dummies, target country dummies, and the paired dummies. And then it would be useful to include variables capturing time variation that may affect both the acquisitions and the climate law adoption. For example, the GDP of the target country. Right now they have a difference in the GDP of the two countries. Maybe the GDP of the target country could be something that could be driving both the dependent and independent variables here. Now, for the diff and diff specification they use, they have this staggered diff and diff, basically, where the idea is that you have not just one period where everybody gets treated. You may have multiple points in time where different units get treated. And so, for example, if you have 2 points of treatment, so 2 years in which, 2 different years in which different countries adopted these laws, you may have this issue where, basically, where you're estimating this effect from. You're estimating it from many different ways, but one of the ways is by looking at the country that was early treated and the countries that were later treated, and using as a control the early treated countries. And this is what is called a not clean instrument, because this is control, because this is when it's already been treated. And if you have treatment effect heterogeneity, this can cause problems. Here in this case in particular, there could be good reasons why you would expect to have treatment effect heterogeneity, because as more countries adopt climate laws, then there may be fewer alternatives where to go and acquire targets. So you may be forced to just acquire the targets there, and also as more companies adopt green values, they may be less willing to avoid targets in countries that have implemented these climate laws. So we have a good reason to believe that there is treatment heterogeneity. We have an estimation that in that case would be problematic. There are solutions, and the authors use one of these solutions. Intuitively, the solution is to basically use only clean units for control. So you use either the never treated units or the last treated units as controls. And the authors, there's several different ways to do this. The authors use the stacked regression, which is the most efficient, but could be biased for the average, for the sample average treatment on the treating, the ADT. And so I think that it's an easy thing for them probably to do diagnostics by Ruben Bacon, and also to look at one of these estimators like Callan and Saldana, which are not biased in this case. And you know, I mean, the authors do this stack regression for one specification. It may be interesting to do for all of them. Then the authors discuss, try to think about potential heterogeneity and show that heterogeneity isn't probably an issue here. So the idea that if there's some anticipation, something else that's causing this adoption of the laws, you would see maybe even before the adoption of the law that there's a change in acquisition rates of targets in the countries that adopted these laws. So this is a dynamic diff and diff, basically, which is problematic as well because of this potential heterogeneous treatment effects, as Sun and Abraham point out. So the fact that you have this heterogeneity could contaminate these and show that there's no pre-trend, even though in fact there is. But again, there's an estimator that the authors can do to resolve that. And the other thing I was thinking when I was looking at this is that, so one interpretation of this graph is that there is a long-term effect. And how do you see the long-term effect? Probably from this estimate, which is greater than plus 4, and it is statistically significant at the 10% level. I think also marginally significant at the 5% level. But when I'm looking at this versus this, they look like they're overlapping. So I was wondering, if you excluded only in between and you had a regression where you only included the greater than plus 4 and less than from minus 4, cleaner test of whether there is a long-term effect. Then the authors do a lot of work in analyzing the mechanisms that could be at play here. And so in some of these cases, they estimate their specification on different subsamples separately. And that makes it very difficult to see if actually there are statistically significant differences between the coefficients they estimate across the two subsamples. So one example is table 5 on high versus low exposure targets. Another is table 8 on large versus small value deals. They could conduct mentioned hypothesis tests on the amount that the estimates are equal. For table 7 on the high versus low political affinity country pairs, where they could estimate that in one model rather than in separate subsamples, simply by including interaction of high political affinity and the introduction of the climate law dummy. Then in table 6 on 1.4, 7 on political affinity, 8 on deal size, and 9 on awareness. It would be interesting to see if these results are robust to using different cutoffs to defining large deal, or large awareness, or large political affinity, all of which are defined in terms of the median, but it may also be interesting to see if that holds true for other quantiles. Then on table 8, on large versus small value deals, the authors interpret as evidence that because there's fewer large deals, that could be a selective enforcement of climate laws to protect nationalistic interests. I think that using the median and interpret that as countries wanting to protect all the above the half is a bit maybe too ambitious. Maybe if you used like the top 10% in terms of size, it would be easier to argue that these are really targets that the government is trying to protect. Then the interpretation of the results of table 9 on acquired country awareness and table 10 on generic awareness. So acquired country awareness is proxied by the public's climate concerns in that Paris country. Generic awareness is proxied by the post-Paris Agreement period. The results are completely opposite in these two tables, and it seems that both are talking about awareness, and so it seems that they're kind of contradictory. Maybe you could combine these in one table and show that when you're accounting for acquired awareness and general awareness, you still get the same results. Then I'll finish in probably 1 minute. So there's a robustness check where the authors check about against confounding events like labor laws adopted at the same time. They do that by excluding cases in which such laws were enacted within 3 years of adopting climate laws. But with long-term effects, this might not be enough, so maybe it would be better to include dummies for this adoption of labor laws in the regressions. And then some additional analysis. Table 11 on withdrawals of deals. I was wondering if CEOs are better aligned incentives, are they more likely to withdraw? So you could interact that maybe. Then they studied the market's reaction to acquisitions by looking at combined cars for the just 639 observations. I think if you study acquired cars, you have an increase of at least 1 order of magnitude in number of observations you have in this regression. And then after dealings are announced, does the market react to the target country passing climate laws? So basically, just to see a bit more about how the market reacts to all this. Then, as a more general point, this is a partial equilibrium result. So I think that it could also be interesting to look at substitution without the force of FDI, and then intra-border substitution of MNAs, and also inter-border substitution with MNAs targeting countries without climate laws. And then that would help us kind of understand, do we really care about this result, or at least how much do we care about this result? Because if there's some of these substitutions going on, maybe not quite as much as if there isn't any substitution going on. Okay, I think, yeah, that's it. Thanks. But I really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, for extremely detailed discussion. And I need to apologize because we did not, because I told you guys the paper was still only a few months old. So we were rushing in sending revised draft to Philippos for him to review. So I think there was, in the version that we sent you, I'm pretty sure there's still some loose ends that we didn't get to tied up. But since then we have a new version that would be more than happy to share with you and get more of your feedback. But a lot of these detailed comments are extremely appreciated. And I would like to just quickly, I think the comment on the conventional DID estimates being biased. I think that's being increasingly recognized in literature, and we haven't done enough. I think we can do more, as you suggested. And then for the subsample differences, I think most of we didn't include the statistics in your in the version that we sent you, and we did test with the statistical signal. They are significant. Regarding the seemingly contradictory results that you mentioned about general awareness of climate change versus acquirers' specific attitude about climate change, I think we need to do a better job explaining that. And just to quickly interpret that, our idea about the importance of a general awareness of climate change having is going to enhance whatever impact that climate law regulation on cross-border acquisitions is that from a perception standpoint, after the signing of the Paris Agreement, after the release of the Stern Review, I think firm decision makers anticipate that whatever law regulations are in place, the regulators will enforce them more forcefully, imposing stronger restriction and costs on future deals. That's why we saw an enhanced effect of climate laws on cross-border acquisitions after those signature events. But for acquirer country-specific awareness, we expect the opposite. So it's really not a contradiction. We should have explained it better. Thank you so much. I'll be more than happy to have your slides so that we can do much.
You're being very modest. I think that you've done a lot of work and the paper is quite poignant already.
Well, thank you.
Thanks for the discussion, and also thanks for Faith for responding to the comments. So I would like to, in the interest of time, we probably can take 2 or 3 questions. So anyone like to? Yes.
So you did talk a lot about climate laws and then being passed, but have you done any looking into climate laws being repealed, and to what extent you'd expect to see like increases in M&A once they've been repealed? So kind of the flip side of the coin. I appreciate the data set would be substantially smaller, but...
That's a great point. We did not think of that. In terms of that, we didn't think that, sample period there would be, well, there's one thing that there's one sliver of evidence that I can share. Okay. So we look at the post Stern Review period, and we separated that into from 2006 to 2016, and then from 2016 and beyond. And somehow we find that the effect of climate laws seems to be a little bit less pronounced in the post-2016 period. And we thought that might have something to do with our famous former president exiting extricating U.S. from the Paris Agreement, basically sending a bad signal that the climate law regulation may not have as strong an effect. So but I think your conjecture is completely reasonable. And we can go back to the database and how many repeals of these laws that we can identify. Yeah, that would be interesting.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else would like to ask a question? Let me just try.
Just a couple of thoughts, Fei. I wasn't totally sure if this was covered in maybe using different terminology, but I would assume that these M&A effects are going to be stronger for firms that are in heavily polluting industries. And second, I wondered whether the effects would be weaker when the economy in the target nation was not doing so well.
Yeah, great point. And we did, in one of the heterogeneity tests, we did find that the chilling effects of the climate law regulations on cross-border acquisitions tend to be concentrated in industries that tend to be the dirty firms. For example, the fossil fuel industry, the mining, heavy manufacturing industries, and utilities. And then in one of this is a problem of trying to come up with a burden for the conference. In one of the tests that we run, but we didn't report, we did control for targeted country GDP that Philippos correctly pointed out, because I think that could be related to both the level of climate regulations in the target country as well as cross-border transactions happening against firms in those countries. We did control for that and resolve it.
Just one last question. Did you find that there were any climate laws that were trying to discourage the export of carbon pollution to other countries?
We can take a, no, we did not look into that, but that's a good point. We can take a look at it. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, we still have time for one more questions, maybe. Anybody else would like to ask? Okay, yes.
Thank you, Professor Fei. I learned a lot from your presentation. I have one minor problem about your country-level control variables. I don't know what's your measure of investment environment. If it's a bilateral investment treaty, I think it's good. If not, I will suggest to use bilateral investment treaty. Based on my knowledge, there are some items related to environmental protection in this bilateral investment treaty, and I think it could be used as the similar law of political affinity. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. I think Jared's paper showed that bilateral treaty between countries can definitely have impact on cross-border transactions, and we can control for that. We just haven't got around to do that. We talked about that, but I don't know why we didn't do that yet. Probably because we didn't have enough time. But thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I think let's move on to the second paper. The speaker is Mohammed from the Schema Business School.
Well, he's getting wired up. For those of you who didn't get coffee because it ran out, or even hot water for tea, there's fresh tea, coffee, and hot water out there. Not that I want to have everybody leave, not to hear the presentation. But that's important for the evaluations when you give it later, that we didn't run out of coffee. So.
Okay, great, thanks. Thank you for putting this paper on the program. The title of the paper is The Innovation Arms Race. It's a joint work with Eric Dubois, who was here this morning. So unfortunately, he had to leave to catch up the train for Brussels, and Jared, who is present here. So currently we are revising the paper, so we are very much looking forward to your thoughts and suggestions. So I will directly jump to the research question. So in this paper, we ask very simple and potentially important research question that, do the acquisitions of innovative targets spur or stifle innovations? So particularly we are analyzing innovative activities of the subject firms, which are in response to the rivals' acquisition of innovative targets. So I will take and help from the anecdote to clarify what do we have in our mind. So the Google versus Microsoft fight in an online advertising industry is an example of the mechanism that we are focusing on. In early 2007, Google and the Microsoft, they fought ferociously to acquire DoubleClick, who is a key player in search-based online advertising. So Google won the battle. Google acquired DoubleClick for $3.1 billion, which became one of the largest transactions in Google's history since its IPO. So now, next for the Microsoft. So Microsoft immediately rushed to acquire another firm, Quantive, in the same industry, and the Microsoft paid $6.2 billion to acquire it, representing a hefty premium of 85%. So this is what we are interested in. We are interested in responsive investments of the subject firms when the rival firms acquire the innovative targets. Okay, so being unable to catch with the Google in an online advertising race, so the Microsoft later in 2012 announced the write-down of $6.2 billion. So this is our second prediction of the paper. We are also interested in the resulting outcome. We are interested in the value implications. So here, perhaps we are looking at one extreme case, but we are interested in analyzing whether such a dramatic arms race are at play in the US. So what do we know on that topic? So a large body of literature on innovation has been developed in financial economics, and there are few studies that also focus on the interactions between innovation and M&A. For example, Athanasev, they look at the effects of the hostile takeover on the innovation. They report the negative effects of the hostile takeover on the innovative activities. And Phillips and Zhdanov, they argue that the large firms, through their acquisition activities, provide incentive to the smaller firms to invest in innovations, to become an attractive targets, and they pay high premium to those firms. One of the closely related paper is Bina and Lee that directly look at the interaction between M&A and innovation. They find that innovative firms are more likely to become target, and the technological overlap between the merging parties increasing the likelihood of the likelihood of a merger pair. Shen and Su, Shen et al., they take the different perspective. They look at the effects of the envy, which is generated by the rival firms winning the innovation award, on the firm's likelihood to engage in M&A activity, and they find that the firm's propensity to acquire another firms increases significantly when their rival firms win those awards, and they explain it from the behavioral perspective. So there is another paper, Cunningham et al. They argue that the firms, they acquire innovative targets to kill their innovation in order to preempt the competition, and they provide the supportive empirical evidence. However, none of these studies do not investigate the effects of the rivals' innovative acquisition on the subject firm's incentive to innovate, and this is what we focus on in this paper. So we have the theoretical support to our predictions from the case of Google and Microsoft. We already have the idea what we are expecting here. So the game theory that provides the necessary theoretical foundation to study the equilibrium outcomes of escalating the competitive situations in which each party focuses on outdoing others within the arms race case. That led us to come up with the responsive investment predictions, implying that the firms should invest more in innovation in response to the rivals' investments in innovations. And in a non-cooperative situations, each player's dominant strategy is to choose the high action, and the resulting Nash equilibrium is worse for everyone than if they had chosen low action. So that we came up with this value decrease prediction, implying that the resulting outcome should be value destroying for the parties in competition, or at least not value increasing. So to test our predictions, we take the universe of listed firms in the US that is available on Trace. We exclude the financial firms. Our sample period covers from 1996 to 2019. That is constrained by Obeg and Phillips similarity score that we use to identify the rivals. We take the M&A data from SDC, mainly focus on the public acquirers. We do not apply filters on the target. We keep public, private, and subsidiary targets. We apply a minimal M&A data screens. We keep the horizontal and non-horizontal acquisitions in our sample. So our data filters yield a sample of 46K transactions worth of $12 trillion, which are conducted by 6,413 unique acquirers. So we have two predictions for the responsive investments. Predictions, the dependent variable, we focus on two different types of the investments, organic versus inorganic investments. For the organic investments, we focus on R&D intensity of the subject firms, and for inorganic investments, we focus on the innovative acquisitions. And for the value decrease hypothesis, we simply take market to book ratio from a French. So one of the challenge for us is to identify the innovative targets. So to identify the innovative targets, we first define the innovative industries. So we work at SIG3 level. For each year, we calculate the R&D intensity of all the firms at the industry level, and then we define the innovative industries are the ones that are in that top quartile of the R&D intensity. And then innovative targets are the ones that comes from those innovative industries. One of the main benefit for us to work at the industry level or to define the innovative industries, that we could keep in our sample both public and the private targets, especially in case of the innovations, because the private targets are the innovatives. For the independent variable, for the responsive investment predictions, we calculate rival innovative acquisition intensity. We identify the innovative acquisition in the SDC sample, and we identify the rivals based on in the product market space, based on the Hoback and Phillips similarity scores. We calculate the number of acquisitions by the rival in a given year and the number of innovative acquisition by the rivals in the same year, and we calculate the ratios, which is number of innovative acquisitions, and we scale with the total number of acquisitions for each firm in the same year. For the value decrease prediction, so here we are interested in looking at the value impact investments in innovation under the pressure of the rivals' investments into the innovative acquisitions. We decompose R&D and innovative acquisition. So first we calculate the historical R&D and historical innovative acquisition averages, and we calculate the excess R&D and excess innovative acquisitions. And we interact excess R&D and historical R&D, and both for innovative acquisitions with our RICI, with our variable of interest. So we are interested in excess R&D and excess investments in the innovative acquisitions, which is the response of the subject firms to the rivals' acquisition of the innovative target, which is so excess R&D and excess innovative acquisition, which is simply the difference between the current year's R&D and the historical R&D, and same for the innovative acquisitions. So for the responsive investment predictions, so these are, we calculate two equations, because one for R&D and one for innovative acquisitions. Both are mutually exclusive. They are not mutually exclusive. The firms do both at the same time. So for R&D equations, our variable of interest is RICI. And for the R&D equation, we control for the firms' investments in innovative targets, and for innovative acquisition equation, we control for the firm's R&D. So under the arms race hypothesis, we expect that the gamma to be positive. And for the value decrease predictions, the variable of interest, we interact excess R&D and excess investments in innovative acquisition with RICI variable, and this is our variable of interest. Under the arms race hypothesis, we expect this to tau to be negative. So what do we find? So we find this empirical support for the arms race predictions that RICI is positively and significantly related with R&D intensity and innovative acquisition, and they are also robust when we control for innovative acquisition and R&D intensity respectively, and excess investment into R&D is negatively and significantly related to the firm valuations. So the firm's investments in innovation in response to the rivals' acquisition of innovative targets destroy the firm value. And the economic impact is also sizable. For example, for the responsive investments, have one standard deviation increase in RICI increases the R&D by 4.3% and innovative acquisitions by almost 50% with respect to their unconditional averages. So the subject firm's response to the innovative to the rivals' acquisition of innovative targets depends on the firm's position in the in an industry. For example, on one hand, the Schumpeter argues that The competition, so the competition puts the financial pressure on the firms, on the subject firms, and it erodes the future innovation trends. So the firms, resultantly, the firms leads towards the cost-cutting strategy, especially they reduce their investments in innovation. And this argument mainly relevant for the weak industry participants that we call in our setting the laggard firms. On the other hand, Arrows argues that in response to the increase in the competition, the firms should invest more in innovation so to restore their quasi-monopoly rights. So if this argument is true, then that should hold for the strong players. We call them the leaders in an industry. And in one of the recent contributions, Agnew et al., they report, they provide that there is a inverted U-shaped relationship between the competition and innovation. So according to this argument, the firms should, only the close competitors should invest more in innovations when there is an increase in the competition coming from the rivals when they invest into the innovative targets. So we use the empirical for leaders and the laggards. We identify the leaders and the laggards firms in a given industry while taking the two dimensions, ROA and the market share. At SIG3 level, at the industry levels, we classify, we sort the firms on both the dimensions. Leader firms are the ones that are in the highest quartile on both the dimensions, and the laggard firms are the ones that are on the lowest quartile of both the firms. And then to test these predictions, we are working on the close competitors, so-called neck-to-neck firms. We identify the neck-to-neck firms which are in the highest quartile of the three closest rivals. So what we do here, we interact the leaders and the laggards with our variable of interest. Both leaders and the laggards, they increase their investments in innovations. So the laggard firm, they invest more in R&D, and the leader firm, they invest more in innovative acquisitions. Both type of investments destroy the value. But when we look at, compare the coefficients, so the leader firms, these are the firms that invest more in innovations in response to the rivals' investments in, when the rival firms acquire the innovative targets. For the neck-to-neck firms, so we find, what firms invest more in innovation in response to the rivals' investments. So it's the close competitors who increase their investments in both innovation, in R&D and innovations, and that destroys the value for the subject firms. For the standard problem, we also, our econometric specification also have this problem of the endogeneity. So far we include the firm fixed effects, seer fixed effects. We include set of time varying control variables, but still there could be concerns about the potential endogenous omitted variables. We adopt an IV approach to test the robustness of the responsive investment predictions. So we are implying the statewide R&D tax credits. So there is a staggered implementation of US federal R&D tax credits in 32 states that has already been used in the literature. So we use the Hall and Jorgensen's user cost of R&D. So we use the R&D user cost to predict the tax-induced R&D of the rival firms. So what do we find? So here, this is the tax-induced R&D of the rival firms that decreases the probability of the rival firms to purchase the innovative targets, and we find the robust results. Our results pass this sensitivity, pass this IV test. We do a bunch of robustness tests. We focus on change of control transactions, focus on acquisitions of only the public targets. Currently we keep both public and the private. Our results are mainly driven by high tech and healthcare industry. We do not find any evidence for the loss of innovation efficiency. So the results are conformed to the extensive margins. We include the firms that are not subject to the rival pressures, and results are also conformed when we calculate our RICI variable based on the value of the acquisitions. So in a nutshell, the innovation arms race hypothesis predicts the responsive investments of the increase in the responsive investments of the subject firms when the rival firms invest in innovations, and resultantly the outcome is the value decrease for the subject firms. So our empirical results are consistent with these predictions. The value decrease predictions signals a transfer of rents to the customers, and regulatory authorities should not worry too much about the innovation incentive side effects of the M&As, generally speaking, but there is a within industry heterogeneity in firms' response to the rival pressure, and therefore each case remains specific. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The speaker is the Juanita from the LSC. You can pick. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yeah? Is this working? Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me discuss this paper. It was a very interesting read. So let me just go into it. I will start with a very broad story of what this paper is about, and then I'll go into my comments. Okay? Okay, so what is this paper about? So this paper explores how firms change their innovations when rivals acquire innovative targets. And if we take results at face value, I think the main result here is that firms increase their innovation investment, and they do this both internally through R&D, but also externally through the acquisition of innovative targets. Now, the other result here, which is interesting, is that as they do that, the market value of the company decreases. So what the authors propose is that these results are consistent with the so-called innovation arms race, where what firms are doing are competing for market share by innovating, thus somewhat paradoxically leading to a rent transfer to consumers from their purchases of innovative targets. Now, overall, a very interesting read. I am mostly in innovation. I don't do much research on mergers and acquisitions, so I learned a lot. I think it's a timely and important topic. As the author was describing at the end, there are regulatory concerns that these papers speaks to. Now, my main comments are going to be the following. I'm going to talk a little bit about measurement. This paper has a ton of decisions to make about how to measure things, and so there's some questions that arise. I'm going to talk a little bit about econometrics, and I do think that this is mostly about the way it's written and questions that I have rather than a problem of actual implementation, but I'll come back to this. Then I'm going to spend most of my time on interpretation, and I've polished a little bit my interpretation through discussions with the authors, so I'm going to give it a try on the go. And finally, a little bit on grading, but that's it. Okay, so measurement. So great job at constructing empirical counterparts for many theoretical variables behind kind of like the arms race hypotheses. There are, of course, multiple decisions that are taken along the way. And what this raises is questions about, this is the old version of the slides. It was not about robustness, but rather about how general the results can be. And so naturally, no proxy is perfect. So what I really suggest authors do is provide more guidance on how to think about the things we may be missing. So let me give you an example. So for example, rivals are based on Huber and Phillips similarity scores, which is basically a measure based on firms' 10K product descriptions. And the more similar those descriptions are, the more likely these firms are to be rivals. That's the idea. Now, this is only available for public firms by definition. And so one thing we could be missing are rivals that are private. Now, of course, the authors are not going to be able to get to this, right? So no proxy is perfect, et cetera. But what are we missing? How much do we care about how privates, how much they innovate and how firms can react to that? So again, my comment here is more about providing guidance to the reader rather than doing much about this. Now, second decision to be made here are the actions that companies take. The actions here are restricted to innovative acquisitions and also R&D. But firms can also participate in alliances, they can buy patents, they can make corporate venture capital investments, and we're very narrowly looking at one specific things that companies can do, which is make these innovative acquisitions. So how much are we missing? Is there a way for the reader to get a sense of that? And finally, innovative targets are firms in 3-digit industries that are in the top quartile of R&D intensity. But of course, there's heterogeneity within firms. And there's an interesting, very interesting analysis that authors do in the second part of the paper, where they describe what they're the industry leaders and the industry laggards. And I wonder whether there's more that could be done along those dimensions, but for the targets. And the list goes on. So I think my point here is more about, in the part when you describe measurement, rather than only describing what you do, also have a commentary on what are the potential things that we're missing and how that impacts the way that we interpret results. So that's my my first comment, which is on measurement. Second comment, it's a group of comments based on econometrics. And so I understand the spirit of the exercises. They're very intuitive and very nicely described. But what I have is several questions about implementation. To give you one example. So to measure innovation responses, the authors use the simultaneous equations model. What's different from the typical models that we would use is that the dependent variables, so for example here R&D, are assumed to be functions of the other dependent variables, for example here innovative acquisitions, rather than just independent variables, which is this RIC or RIC, which is kind of like the main variable of interest. So what I'm clear here is exactly how this is estimated. We have a problem of strict exogeneity, which is being violated. The authors do mention that they can appeal to the conditional mean independence theorem, but they're not exactly clear as to why that would be the case or how they use it. If they estimated, I'm also unclear about the interpretation. This is another example of bad controls, as I think Filippo was mentioning before in his discussion. So my suggestion here again is improve the explanation. The authors do seem to be aware of this because they actually say results go through even if we include it or we don't include it. So then perhaps drop, I'm not sure, but improve the explanation of what's going on. Something similar happens in other types of regressions, where the coefficient of interest is really an interaction, but as far as I can see, and I may be interpreting this incorrectly, one of the components of the interactions is not included as one of the regressors on its own. It is possible that this is somehow absorbed. I didn't see how that could be the case. So again, this is about just explaining a bit more how these exercises are performed. Okay, now, of course, the slide of identification, and the authors do have a strategy to go after this, and I think is very clever. So to identify the causal effects, what they want to do is they exploit changes in R&D tax credits as an instrument for out-of-state rivals' innovative acquisitions. And here, to be clear, the concern is that even if we observe firms acting in a particular way when rivals go after innovative acquisitions, we don't know whether this is a causal effect or whether this is somehow like occurring simultaneously. There's like some endogenous factor that is explaining both of these types of actions. So to address that concern, they go after this. But my main suggestion here is, before jumping to the IV, how about take one step back and tell me more about the difference between the rivals that are local and the rivals that are out of state, because the out of state ones are the ones that have been moved by this R&D kind of instrument. And there's no discussion about that. And that, I think, is a missed opportunity. Because this whole paper is about competition in private space, but we know that geography is also crucial. So actually, I would like to know more. Do firms respond more to acquisitions by rivals that are local to them? Do they respond less? There's like a missed opportunity to say so much more in particular that you've got. In terms of implementation, we spoke about this in the break. I was unclear about exactly how it was implemented because there was like another layer of using information. It's not here, so this is the wrong set of lines, from another paper. But the authors explain that what's going on here is that gives them very interesting variation in the intensity of treatment. And I'm all the way for it. I love intensity of treatment, so keep that, but just explain more. Okay, interpretation. Again, this is not the first set of slides. But let me talk about interpretation, because this is what we discussed in the break for a long time, and I think it's a very interesting part of the paper. is the innovation arms race hypotheses. And to do that, they have two sets of results. So first they show that as a firm, as the rivals of a firm invest in innovative acquisitions, what the firm does is invest in innovative acquisitions as well. But on top of that, they show that the value of the firm decreases. And they're interpreting this as evidence of potential rent dissipation from the firm to consumers. Now, my reaction to that is the following. I think there are other interpretations of that result. So one first interpretation of the decrease in value is that the firm is left with a bad target. And what we observe in the decrease in the value is a reflection of that rather than this dissipation of rents to consumers. So think about rivals. They're going for the best targets out there that are innovative. The firm reacts. What is the firm buying? In the rush to do something, they just buy whichever innovative target they can get, and may not be the best. And that's why the value of the firm decreases. Now, another interpretation of that result instead is that the firms, again, in the rush to do something, are paying a high premium. And so the decrease in the value of the company is not so much rent dissipation to consumers, but rather a reflection of the higher premium they're paying. Now, finally, another interpretation is that the market has no clue about how to value innovations. And this decrease in the value of the firm is just mismeasure of innovation, which we know exists. We have several papers that have shown how the market is not so great at valuing the innovation that firms pursue. So there are many ways to try and tease apart those explanations. Let me give you some. So to strengthen the idea that this is dissipation of rents to consumers, one thing that the authors could do is split the data across firms based on profitability. Presumably the dissipation is meant to be stronger for firms that have rents to give away to consumers to begin with. To go after ruling out or ruling in the idea of the bad targets, one thing that the firms could do is compare the targets of the firms and the targets of the rivals along a bunch of characteristics, and they have very cool data to be able to do this. Now, to look at the premia, we discussed this already. You can just go and look at premia. Are rivals paying less of a premia than the firms? That's something you can do. And finally, to go about after the mismeasurement, one thing you can do is classify industries based on the opacity of the innovation that these industries have, and that's a measure of how well the market is at actually measuring the value of these companies. But those are suggestions. Perhaps there's more things you could do just to polish and go after that result, and ignore this. Writing, I think the language needs to be more careful before you get to the part of the causality, because you talk about causal effects before you actually get to the ID results, and that makes the job of the referee very easy, so make it harder. So to conclude, very interesting read. Thank you so much for having me. I loved it. Timely and important topic, main comments, different dimensions, but good luck. Oh, thank you.
Yeah, perfect timing. Thanks very much for the discussion. Mohammed, would you like to respond to the comment first before we open the floor to the audience?
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for this detailed and very thoughtful feedback. All of your comments are very well taken. So just to respond very quickly, a couple of comments. For example, here we are only focusing on the listed firms because one of the limitations is Holberg and Philip is available for the listed firms. Yes, we could work also. Then we have to redefine the industries at the SIG3 level. That could allow us to include the private targets as well. And for the higher premium, we already discussed, so that's the way to go. So maybe the value decrease could be potentially because, so when there is a rival firms are purchasing the innovative targets, like the case of Google and the Microsoft, they rush to acquire the targets and they paid the high premium, and that could be translated into the lower market valuation afterwards. That could be one of the explanations. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Do we have any questions?
So just a minor comment. Let's be a little bit careful because you're not really showing a value decrease, and maybe you can show that more directly. You're showing a decrease in the market-to-book ratio, or Q, right? And any sort of standard real options model would predict that when you make innovative investments, or when you exercise your growth options, to put it a little bit more succinctly, when you exercise your growth options, Q is going to go down, the market-to-book ratio is going to go down. I believe you're right in your interpretation, but at least theoretically it's possible that they're doing everything right, positive NPV investments, no rents are being dissipated. It just so happens that while marginal Q is going towards 1, while you're doing everything right, God knows what happens to average Q, but it's probably going down as well. Right? So at least in theory, it would be consistent with nothing bad happening at all. So maybe just kind of think a little bit harder about whether you can directly show that those acquisitions are actually kind of bad for shareholders.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
And
Just one last thought. It seems like the benefits of innovation are not fully captured in the current analysis, the way at least I understand it. Because it seems like there can be a benefit in that the innovation increases the aggregate market sales. And then if that's shared between the rivals to some degree, then there's a somewhat offsetting benefit that you could be getting. So in other words, it could be interesting to see what happens if you break the sample into situations where the markets are growing very quickly versus not so quickly.
Yeah, thank you. That's also a very interesting suggestion. We could look at that. We don't do it for now.
okay, so maybe I can take the advantage and ask one question. So I wonder, for the story to be complete, because the firms are constantly innovating, right, especially for technology firms, but for the story to be complete, do you actually need a follow-in in-house or external acquisition to pursuing the same technique? And also, if, like, say, it is an option, can the firm actually pursue so just like hiring the key persons in the target company rather than just to buy another peer company?
Yeah, that could be also a possibility, but I'm not sure that we have so far this data to observe it. But yeah, if we could have the data, that would be very, very useful.
Very interesting paper. I just have one minor question about your measurement of excess R&D and historical R&D. As you presented, you used look at the past 3 years R&D. Have you tried the past 5 years? And secondly, you used the equally weighted R&D. I remember there's a RFS paper stating that the R&D can show a discount effect, which means the R&D in year T-5 can be less valuable to year T or T-1. So they use a discounted rate 20% and look at the 5 past years. I think you can try another measure of R&D. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. No. I think we did not do it. We did not try looking at the different windows to measure the historical R&D, but we could do it easily. Yeah, we could also check while instead of focusing on the R&D intensity, while looking at the stock of R&D. So where we could look at the depreciation of R&D over a period of time. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any more questions? Okay. If there are no more takers, and I guess I can report happily to the conference chairs committee that we finished ahead of schedule. Before I pass it to Anne, I would just kindly ask everyone to join me to thank the speakers and the discussant for their excellent talk.
All right, so that comes to the final item in the agenda. So Scott is in the program. I have half an hour for the closing and remark. So Jared was asking me, what am I going to talk in half an hour? I can present my paper, but probably you all want to get out of here. So it's been a long day, but very interesting. I would like to thank the presenters for presenting us with very interesting new research, for the chairs to learn how to use the iPad timing app, keeping the time and doing a marathon around the room. All right, and for the discussion for a phenomenal talk here. And you probably don't know how happy I was when I get a reply from the discussion invitation saying yes, because I know that the authors and I really appreciate your time and effort. So a very big thank to you. I think the call for paper for next year is going to come out at the end of this year, probably a bit early than before. And I would like to thank Priscilla, especially for making the conference possible. The ECGI for their support, and the event team, the IT support from Matt Drew, who's been here throughout the day and keeping the IT gremlins away, probably. I think Priscilla is going to email you for comments and feedback, but feel free to give us some of those before you leave. I think in the end, I wish you all safe travels home. But for now, we have a reception outside with wine. And for us, we have a dinner on the 3rd floor at 6 for conference chair, discussion, and the presenters. All right, so thanks again for everyone for your contributions.